Welcome to the Preventive Conservation Workshop, an educational event brought to you within the Sustainable Ukrainian Canadian Heritage Program, or SUCH for short, and the Ukrainian Canadian Congress Archives Committee. SUCH is a multifaceted program at the Kule Folklore Centre, University of Alberta. I'm your host, Marina Chernevska, and I coordinate SUCH program. I'm also a co-chair of the UCC Archives Committee. You can learn more about the program and the committee and about the work we do on our websites, and the links are in the chat for your convenience. A few housekeeping items. We ask that you keep your microphones off. You can keep your camera on or off, it's up to you, although it's really nice to see familiar faces and some new faces. This workshop is recorded and it will be made available online. Everyone who registered will receive a notification when it's been posted. You already have access to the notes of the instructors that were provided. I would like to thank everyone who answered my short questionnaire and provided their questions ahead of time. We will try to address as many of them as possible during the workshop, and in the end, in the question and answers part. We will not be able to answer those questions that are not directly related to the topic of today's workshop, such as arrangement and description, for example, but they will be addressed in future workshops, and we will get in touch with you to recommend resources that can help you in the meantime. If during the workshop you have questions to the instructors, please type them in the chat. If there is time at the end, we will try to answer them as well. And if not, we again will follow up with you at a later time. The instructors of today's workshop are an amazing team from the Provincial Archives of Alberta. And I would like to turn it over to them. Please introduce yourself briefly. Over to you, Alison.
Thanks, Marina. My name is Alison Freake. I'm a conservator here at the Provincial Archives of Alberta. And we've sort of been working on how to best reach participants in the last couple of years, because we, of course, haven't been able to do on-site workshops. Typically, this would be in person. So hopefully this will be of use, and hopefully in the future, we'll be able to see more of you in person. But this will do for now. And as Marina said, hopefully this presentation will help answer a lot of your questions. We do tend to see similar types of questions, so it helps to have some questions in advance, because that can help guide how we approach workshop. So the way we'll structure this today, it's myself and Cassidy Kingston, who is in a separate screen. She'll be doing the lecture portion of the workshop, and that's where you'll find a lot of answers to your questions. And after that, we'll take a short break, maybe 5 minutes or so, and then you would have all received a package of materials, yes, for the encapsulation exercise. And so Stephanie Olson, who is an intern with me here at the Provincial Archives, Cassidy is a Young Canada Works intern, and Stephanie is a Fleming College student who's finishing up her program. So Stephanie will go through the encapsulation exercise. And the idea is to just illustrate and demonstrate a practice that we commonly use in the archives. Instead of laminating something, a document, this is a reversible kind of package that can help prevent separation of pieces from a document that's been damaged. And it's also easily reversible. So if you need to take it out, you can.
Don't laminate.
Don't put tape on anything. Okay, if you take anything away from this workshop, no tape, don't use tape on anything, and don't laminate anything. And Cassidy can tell you how many hours she spent taking tape from a 19th century book about reserve lands. She spent several months doing that. And then after that, towards the end, we will do more of a question and answer, and maybe by then some more questions will have come up. And as Marina said, you can enter them into the chat, and we'll see what we can do to address those then. It might be necessary to do some follow-up, but we'll figure that out later. If anybody has any a need for specific resources or direction, then we can figure it out from there. So I guess Cassidy, you're going to start.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen now for the presentation. All right, as Alison said, I'm the Young Canada Works intern here in the Conservation Lab. My name is Cassidy. So I'm just going to begin by giving you a brief introduction of what our main goals here at the Provincial Archives are. For any of you who might not be too familiar, we are a part of the Ministry of Culture, Multiculturalism, and the Status of Women Heritage Division. So we are a sister branch to the Royal Alberta Museum and the Royal Tyrrell Museum and other provincial heritage sites. Our three main goals we describe as acquire, preserve, and to make available. So initially, we acquire records from government departments as the official record keeper of Government of Alberta activities. So we work with government departments to determine which documents are to be kept for the long term. We also have a private records program through which we accept donations from individuals, families, business, nonprofit organizations, religious organizations, and other entities that want to see their documentary past retained. We also preserve, that's where we come in. This is where our main job is the preservation of records within our facility, but we like to push it beyond our walls to include activities like this in the hope that we can have an impact on the preservation of records owned by the public. It's not all about us. We work to rehouse records in archival quality materials and arrange materials in a way that they can be safely accessed in the future. This leads into our third main goal, which is to make available. We interpret this goal in a couple of different ways. We do make records accessible in the traditional way in our reading room, but also have online accessibility for some vital statistics, as well as exhibits and tours that are designed to bring in folks into the archives and let the public into the back of the house area. Right now, though, our reading room is open by appointment. Actually, sorry, no, it's not open to the public at all points. We were open by appointment during the pandemic, during the shutdown, but we are fully opened Tuesday to Friday in the reading room if anyone would like to stop by and take a look at anything. All right. So the first thing that you need to do whenever you have a collection is assess what you have. This includes figuring out what types of materials you have in your collection. This will help you determine the proper environment, the proper materials to use, and can also help assess what treatments might be necessary. Every material type is going to require a little bit of interpretation on how you're going to best preserve it. For example, some people have asked what to do with a stiff piece of paper that's been folded for 150 years, but it turns out that it isn't paper at all, but it's actually parchment. And parchment or vellum are going to be different treatment processes because they're actually skin products, not cellulose. And they also sometimes will require different materials for storage. So first, we're going to start with cellulose-based objects. This is going to be your paper-based products, such as letters, certificates, books, maps, prints, photographs, drawings, and watercolors. This is typically the materials we work with the most at the archives. However, we do contain other material types in our collections, which is why it's always important to assess first in a box to see whether or not it is all just paper, whether or not you have additional products in there. Composite objects are a big thing. Having staples in the paper is going to affect how you're going to store it. The environment needs to be in. So some other paper products include glass lantern slides and negatives, AV, motion picture film, video, audio tapes and discs, works of art on paper or other surfaces. It's also important to note that these are hygroscopic materials, so they absolutely love water. However, we don't love that they love water, so you need to be very, very careful with the relative humidity that you keep them in. Because this will have severe reactions for them. All right, now onto protein-based objects. The best way of describing these are pretty much if they're animal-made or animal byproducts, it's probably protein-based. This includes one that people don't really realize, which is silk. That is protein-based objects because it is produced by a bug. So our protein-based materials are prevalent among archival collections, and you have to remember that they will also respond to changes in the atmosphere, mainly temperature and the associated relative humidity changes. These objects may require different treatment than paper, although they do tend to be more structurally sound than paper. Some composite cellulose and protein-based objects, an example of that would be leather-bound books. So they are both going to react differently to the same environment, which affects how treatment will end up occurring. Some other objects that we have in the archives are going to be glass plate negatives, ambrotypes, which are photographs printed on glass, daguerreotype, which is photographs printed on silver, ferrotype, which is photographs printed on iron, and then polymer film. We also have some wax seals on things here. So most of these materials have multiple layers. One or more of these layers may expand or contract with intake or release of atmospheric moisture. So these shifts can cause mechanical damage as the layers move in opposite directions, or one layer remains static while others move. This is highly common in photographs because all photographs do contain an emulsion layer, which is the layer that does have the image. Often this is made of gelatin, which will expand or swell severely with moisture. So you wouldn't normally think of paper-based objects as being composite, but think about seals attached to paper, parchment, photographic images printed on metal or glass plates, and scrapbooks with dried leaves and flowers, papers with staples and paper clips. These are all things that need to be considered when determining the proper environment and storage for an object. Now, what can go wrong? Many things, many things. So we determine these by organizing them into the agents of deterioration. So if you go into the Canadian Conservation Institute's website, they list 10 agents of deterioration, but we're going to focus on the main categories that affect archival collections in the home. This is biological deterioration, physical damage, chemical damage, and pollutants. These can all help you recognize signs of damage and what the risks are to your collection, and also help you to make more informed decisions about how and where to store them. So first we start with biological deterioration, which is damage caused by pests like mice, birds, insects, or microorganisms like fungi, which is mold. Mold damage results from materials being exposed to moisture. Not only is it a result of catastrophic water damage, but it can also result from high levels of relative humidity in a storage area. Commonly seen in photographic prints and negatives, as well as AV materials, since the gelatin layer is extremely sensitive to moisture. Mold can leave nasty stains or literally consume parts of images, which is why it is very important to address mold as quickly as possible. Additionally, pests like mice are known to nibble through boxes and papers, leaving droppings behind, as well as nests. Hantavirus is a respiratory illness that can be spread by deer mice and is a common concern in Alberta. So be careful to wear respiratory protection and gloves if a deer mouse infestation is suspected. Other pests, like insects, are known to be attracted to paper. Silverfish graze across the surface of paper. Book lice are attracted to hide glues used in book bindings. These are just some of examples of insects that you might see within an archives, but there are more. Next, we move on to chemical deterioration, which we commonly refer in conservation as an inherent vice, which means that it's caused by the object itself and the process that occurred in order to make it. So over time, essentially, it will begin to degrade on its own. This just means that innate characteristics of an object or material contributes to its degradation, so it's self-destructive over time. An example of this would be groundwood pulp, which is used to create newsprint and has a high tannin and acid content, which leads to the deterioration of the paper quickly after production. Lignin that hasn't been bleached from the paper contributes to its discoloration, especially if it's left exposed to light. Another example would be acetate negatives, which are made from cellulose acetate, which breaks down relatively quick. leaving the base crumbly and unstable and the emulsion covered with bumps and crocodile cracks. This deterioration is also known as vinegar syndrome for its characteristic smell. Inherent vice may also refer to the manner in which an object was produced. For example, some 19th century photographic prints exhibit deterioration that is a result of ineffective fixing baths, which were used to literally fix the image and render it stable as a print. Thiosulfates combine with silver ions to soluble molecules so that the fixer and excess silver can be washed away. If the fixer was not washed out, salts were left behind on the print. These react with humidity over time to produce silver sulfide and discolor the halftones of the print to yellow or brown. All right, chemical damage can also be caused by changes introduced in a material by a chemical interaction. Environmental effects are a common way for chemical reactions to be accelerated. The temperature and relative humidity are important factors, as these are the most variable factors to which most collections are subjected to. These variables impact archival materials by increasing rates of deterioration. For example, high relative humidity will cause hydrolysis, leading to the destruction of bonds within cellulose chains, weakening the paper overall. High humidity can also accelerate oxidation, which causes discoloration of papers. High humidity environments are also breeding grounds for mold. Adding high temperature to any of these high humidity situations serves to accelerate the degradation processes. Discoloration and weakening are also initiated on a molecular level from exposure to light and UV radiation. This is why you may have seen a framed paper object discolor or faded after being on display for many years. It is also important to mention that physical damage can occur as a result of chemical damage. This is because chemical deterioration can cause the material to become weak and perhaps brittle, making it more difficult to handle safely. All right, so pollutants. I can guarantee that your family archive has pollutants somewhere. These are not just like smoke, but really anything that has been introduced to the object during its lifetime. This includes particulate pollutants like soot or dust, and the bane of our existence, as Alison has mentioned, tape. Many tears will be shed if you have a lot of tape in your collection. Gaseous pollutants can also be introduced from other objects in your collection. For example, the acidic smell from cellulose acetate negatives accelerates the deterioration surrounding it. The metal lock on your leather-bound diary will corrode from the sulfur in the leather itself. Acids can also accelerate the hydrolysis of papers in a self-perpetuating cycle, and the same can be true for oxidation. All right, like I mentioned before, mechanical damage is often a consequence of chemical damage because the material is weakened at a cellular level. So brittle papers tear and break more readily, and poor handling practices speed up the process of deterioration. Audio tapes and films are susceptible to damage when used in machines for access. Dust can also be considered a means of mechanical damage since it can cause scratching on photographic materials and other fragile surfaces. It also traps moisture closer to the surface of the object and could be a tasty snack for damp in a damp environment. In many cases, a combination of all these factors plus others cause serious damage to an item. Unfortunately, it often takes an extended period of time for the consequences of these factors to become visible and have an impact on the accessibility of the records. By this time, though, the cost of reversing or stabilizing the item will have increased exponentially. That's why it's very important to always monitor an environment. So what can you do? The best thing for you to do is to focus on preventing damage. This means good storage practices, consistent labeling, and careful handling. It is also important to recognize when the object is changing and requires more help than just good storage. Some objects will eventually need help, but if you catch it early enough, you can limit the damage. When it does come to the point where it does need help, usually the best option is to bring it to a conservator. We are going to be the ones who know what to do best to prevent further damage past that point. Some benefits of good storage means easier access to materials that have been damaged, for example, using sleeves or folders. Safety of family information, it's easier to keep materials together, easier identification, and protection of fragile media. So please try to avoid repairing things yourself. In many cases, storing objects in sleeves can render them readable and accessible without interventive treatment, which is why we are going to teach you encapsulation, because that is going to be one of the best methods for that purpose. All right, textual records. Use acid-free materials to limit damage. Use good labeling practices to minimize handling. Use a simple spreadsheet to list items or files rather than trying to reorganize everything. Store things flat and unfolded whenever possible, but if the document doesn't open easily, don't force it open. Brittle paper should be relaxed before flattening, or it may break further. It's good to remember that fold lines are weak spots for paper, and repeatedly opening and closing a document adds to the stress along the fold lines. So if a document has to be folded for storage, choose the largest possible container and fold along original lines. Don't create new ones, because folding the minimum number of times is always going to be the best option. So for photographic prints, you can use photo envelopes or photo sleeves. Either can be used, but there are things to consider. For prints, it's easier to see the images in the plastic sleeves without having to remove them. The paper envelopes are better, though, if the storage environment may be a problem and the humidity is too high. And it's also important to consider whether or not an order is important for storage, in which case envelope photo sleeves are probably the best option if you need to keep them in original order and be able to see them in that way. For negatives, acetate and nitrate negatives are best stored in buffer paper envelopes, although more recent formats are best suited to 35mm plastic sleeves. The same issues apply, though. If the RH is too high, then paper is always best. For good labeling, ensure that you don't have to rifle through an entire box to find the letter you are looking for. This is why storage is very important. We recommend that you use pencil for all labeling. It is clear and reversible. For photographic prints, label on reverse with a 6B pencil along the margin, never directly behind the image. The impressions left by the writing utensil may be visible from the front, which disfigures the print. Use a soft pencil, like a 6B pencil, to avoid having the point leave an impression on the emulsion layer. That being said, it is always preferable to label the enclosure, but be sure to do it before you put the print or negative inside. You don't want the pencil to leave any impressions on the emulsion layer at the front. Also, do not apply labels of any kind to the original document. It's fine for plastic enclosures, but not on the objects themselves. Next, for bound volumes, including diaries and scrapbooks, they can sustain damage if they are stored upright, as books are on a shelf, because of the text block can pull away from the spine. They also tend to sustain more damage because people often pull the book out of the head of the spine. So it's always best to pull them out by enclosing your entire hand around the spine and grasping it by the front and back cover. Standard size books may be stored spine down in file folders and boxes. Fragile and oversized books should be stored flat in a wrapper or a custom box. Scrapbooks can also be stored flat in a wrapper or custom box. It may also be useful to interleave pages that contain photographs, but only where the binding would not be strained. So do not interleave every single page if it's not necessary, because it will cause strain to the binding. It's also important that if you do have newspaper print inside of a scrapbook, it's also a good idea to interleave for those situations, because newspaper print, the media is very unstable and it does have a tendency of rubbing off. So it's important to interleave whenever it comes to newspaper print within scrapbooks. Custom boxes can be made out of mat board, coroplast, or binder's board. There are many tutorials online which show how to make a 4-flap folder as well, and phase boxes for books. All right, for oversized documents and photos, they should be stored flat in a reinforced 4-flap folder and in a custom box. However, if your documents are rolled or folded, do not attempt to unroll them while they are dry. These need to be humidified and flattened carefully since they risk cracking easily, especially the emulsion side of a photograph. And very much as well for parchment will crack very easily. So for humidification and flattening, this is something that can be done at home. You can use household materials sometimes for this. So in the lab, when we humidify objects, we take into account the type of paper, the media, and how tightly it is rolled or creased and how we will dry it. We use different types of humidification, but all share the same principle. When water is introduced to paper, it actually lubricates the cellulose chains that make up the paper structure. When we say that the paper becomes more pliable, it is because the cellulose chains themselves are able to slide past one another more easily. Some basic humidification can be performed at home. This is safe for objects like newspapers, printed maps that have no inscriptions or coloring, or blueprints that don't have any other stamps or inscriptions. We need to specify the types of media here, like colored inks, watercolors, and handwritten pen inscriptions, because these can be water soluble and may run when humidified and flattened improperly. This is why we always test media prior to pursuing with any humidification and flattening to ensure that the media is not going to be highly soluble and will run and cause further damage. Home treatment is also not recommended when there are multiple media types. Example, photos stuck onto paper, indentures that have seals, because they will not flatten properly as the different materials react differently to the humidity. We also recommend against doing this at home for photographs because the emulsion layer is very susceptible to physical damage when it is softened. If you do humidify things at home, they will need to be flattened carefully between layers of blotter paper, which can be weighted down to dry, but not too heavily. For audio-visual records, it's important to remember that motion picture film is stable, more so than magnetic tape or digital copies. So don't ever dispose of original motion picture film. It will likely outlast any other media you could transfer it to, including digital. Groove discs are coming back in popularity, and collectors love to play their originals, but remember that playing them does cause microscopic damage eventually. So it's important to store them in a dust-free jacket to avoid dust buildup in the grooves and to maintain the player to avoid scratching the disc. We frequently get questions about scanning and images and documents and whether it is safe to do so. At the Provincial Archives, we recommend making high-resolution scans and minimizing the number of times an object has to be exposed to the harsh light of a scanner. It is better to make a high-resolution master copy in an uncompressed format and then make JPEGs from that master copy. The JPEGs are small enough to email and to use in various formats, but the original master is there as a source rather than having to scan the original again. Our process is to scan all images at 8x10, even if they are smaller, at a resolution of a minimum of 300 dpi, and to save it as a TIFF format. This image is not altered in any way so that the master is as close to the original as possible. From this master image, any number of images can be created by resizing, cropping, or making corrections in Photoshop. You can probably get away with a slightly lower resolution for a document as opposed to a photo, but don't go lower than 150 dpi. Remember to back up all work onto an external hard drive and to migrate the images regularly, avoiding using optical discs for storage. So storage environments. So avoid storage in basements or attics because they suffer the most fluctuations in temperature and humidity and are usually the first locations of water leaks. Shelving should be at least 4 to 6 inches off the floor. A room within a room is ideal without windows. And dust covers for larger objects are also great to prevent dust buildup. Some examples of storage environments, most of our vaults here are around 20 to 40% relative humidity fluctuation, and most of the vaults are anywhere from 18 to 25 degrees, unless they are cold or freezer storage. So storage materials that we use, it's always important to make sure that it is lignin free because lignin is a substance in plant cell walls that provides support to the growing plant. However, it's chemically unstable when exposed to light and degrades into acidic components. This is what causes old newspapers to turn brown. Acid-free means that the paper is neutral or alkaline. It can become alkaline or buffered from the addition of a basic carbonate like magnesium carbonate or calcium carbonate. These kinds of paper can be used for envelopes or enclosures to counteract the residual acidity of the material inside the enclosure. Buffered materials are best for things like newsprint. Some materials will react in an alkaline environment, so buffered wrapping in close contact can cause damage. For example, blueprints will discolor and the image will fade in a buffered enclosure. In this case, lignin-free neutral pH paper should be used. Color photographs, leather bindings, and negatives should also not be stored in buffered envelopes. Inert refers to plastics that do not break down in the presence of chemicals and byproducts of deterioration of archival material. Mainly, these are polyethylene, polypropylene, and polyester. Polyvinyl chloride plastics are a poor quality plastic for archival purposes because of the reaction with moisture in the atmosphere, which produces hydrochloric acid, which then damages the materials in contact with the plastic. Be wary of colored sheets, plastics that feel like a shower curtain or feel coated. Go for brand names like Printfile or products that are named as the above polyplastics. Marketers have been playing up the term acid-free in order to promote inferior products. In some cases, the term is used incorrectly. Plastics should be inert, not acid-free. Paper products should be acid-free. So for care and handling, a question we often get is whether or not we wear gloves. Typically, we only wear gloves if handling photographic materials or audio-visual stuff. And for this, we wear nitrile gloves. Outside of that, our dexterity and tactile sensation is better without gloves, which is better for some treatments. For extremely fragile materials, always make sure your hands are clean. And also avoid hand moisturizers during the day. Even the non-greasy stuff will leave a residue. Instead of removing one item from a folder, always make sure to take out the entire folder. And when packing boxes, fill in any empty space with a coroplast spacer to prevent slumping folders. As you know, paper is very flexible, so if it flumps for an extended period of time, eventually the paper will start to take that form. So it's always best to make sure everything is upright and stored tightly. When exhibiting or displaying objects, it's important to remember that display areas should have dimmed lighting of less than 150 lux if possible. It's always good to display away from direct lighting and bright sunny windows. If you take your object to a framing shop, you should be prepared to ask some questions about their materials. Mats do serve a purpose other than looking nice. They protect your print or photograph from sticking to the glass. So it's always best to have a protective barrier so that the photograph is not directly touching the glass in a frame. And a good question to ask is how the object will be secured to the mat, especially if you request a float mounting. With an overmat, a non-adhesive method like polyester photo corners is ideal. And otherwise, our old friend wheat starch paste and Japanese paper is the way to go. They typically will create hinges to adhere. Often, interventive treatment isn't a realistic goal due to lack of resources for specialized staff. This is why preservation is the best method. In the long run, always prefer preventive over interventive. Even for ourselves, when we do have access, we still like to focus more on preventive. Less intervention is always going to be the better option. So the focus should always be placed on environmental control and preventive measures. The result may be longer term, but the immediate benefits of proper storage and handling prevent damage that can only be repaired through direct conservation treatment. Avoid doing anything that is time consuming or that leaves you wondering if you've done too much. Also, don't do anything that can't be easily reversed or removed. That is the main pinnacle of any of our treatments here, is whether or not it is reversible. When in doubt, the best thing to do is to store the pieces of an item together in a folder or box so that they aren't lost and can easily be labeled for safe storage and future assessment. The Canadian Association for Conservation of Cultural Property is always a good resource if you have any questions. And the Canadian Association of Professional Conservators is also always going to be a good resource. They have good websites. They make it pretty easily accessible, and there's a lot of information provided there. And that is the end of our presentation. I do believe we're going to be doing questions at the end of the encapsulation presentation. I'm going to stop
Cassidy,
sharing.
there was a question during your, when you were talking about scrapbooks, I think. There was a question, what is interleaving?
Okay, so interleaving, it means you're going to take a thin tissue paper and you're going to, but don't use store-bought tissue paper. It's best to always go with interleaving tissue that is archival grade. Tissue paper that you buy from the store is typically going to have additives that will deteriorate over time and cause issues. But you're going to take a thin interleaving piece of tissue, typically fit to the size of the page, maybe a little bit smaller, but as long as everything on the surface of the page is covered, and you're just going to place it in between pages. The reason we say try not to do it to every single page if you don't need to is because as you add paper to a book, stacking onto it, it's going to increase the size of the book. And when you bind a book, it's going to be bound to the specific size of the number of pages that are already in it. So if you're now making it larger than it initially was when it was bound, it's going to put strain on that binding.
Thank you, Cassidy. There are several more clarifications. Can we address them now, or
if Alison's okay with that, I'm fine to do that now.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So you mentioned several types of inert plastic.
Yeah.
But people didn't catch, and could you repeat it, please? Or I don't think it's in the notes, is it?
I don't think the extensive list is, but I can in fact repeat that. I just gotta.
And you mentioned print file. Print file is a brand name.
It's a brand name.
Yeah.
So polyethylene, polypropylene, and polyester are going to be your inert plastics that you're going to want to look for. So if you go to, say, Walmart or Michael's and you're looking to buy sleeves for anything, or any type of, even if you're storing in plastic bins, it's always important to check the plastics over looking for labels that say that it's archival or that it's acid-free or inert. It's always best to make sure that you look specifically for those plastic types. So those are going to be the poly types. However, polyvinyl chloride is going to be poor quality.
Can I just interject here for a second?
Yes, you
because one of the problems that we've seen in the past is where you can buy photo sleeves that have two different kinds of plastic in it. But they're still marketed as acid-free. So what happens is they use a clear plastic for the front where you're view the photograph, and that might test as polypropylene or polyethylene. So that will be fine. But sometimes they use like a different kind of plastic on the back, on the reverse, and it's sort of like it has like a bubbly, a nubbly texture to it. And we found that in the past, those are often PVC. So if you're going to buy photo sleeves, it's better to buy those that are the same kind of plastic throughout the whole sleeve. Because if you get two different types of plastic or two different kinds of surfaces, one might be acid-free and be fine, or be inert and be fine, but the other may not be. So that's why we usually recommend print file, because we know that they're consistent. It's a consistent material throughout.
So
no PVC. PVC is
no.
PVC.
PVC is the polyvinyl chloride, and that's not stable. And of course, PVC is one of the plastics you see very, very commonly. But yeah, no PVC, polyethylene, polypropylene, and polyester.
Cassidy, can we go quickly back to the interleaving? People are asking if it's worth interleaving newspapers and magazines?
If it's just the newspaper itself, not really. It's more of a concern. I mentioned newspaper if it's in a scrapbook or anywhere else, because like I said, the media in newspapers is highly unstable. And it does have a tendency, if everyone has probably noticed, if you hold a newspaper for too long and handle it, you'll start to see the ink on your fingers. So it's important when it's in a scrapbook that whenever you see newspapers, it's always a good idea to interleave so that the media doesn't transfer onto anything else. However, if it's a newspaper itself or a magazine itself, there's not really much need for interleaving. It's more of a protective method for photographs, most cases.
Yeah, you can interleave newspapers, but you'd go through an awful lot of interleaving.
Yeah.
That's the problem with newspapers is that, I mean, you can use buffered tissue within newspapers to kind of help preserve the paper itself, but you'd use a lot of it. That's the problem. So newspapers present kind of a different challenge, just because of the volume that you will end up with. So you can use tissue and boxes, but I think if you have a large quantity of newspapers, you would have to consider a long-term strategy for.
Yeah, it's not always worth the effort.
Yeah.
Thank you. And also at the end, when you were talking about framing photographs and about attaching an image to the mat, you mentioned how exactly do you attach the image to the mat?
So photo corners are an option. Like I did mention.
What kind of photo corners? Because they also come in different, like you wouldn't recommend buying them in Dollarama.
No, you can get clear plastic,
Yeah.
polyester or polypropylene photo corners, and they come in different sizes.
I was going to say when it comes to that, it's still going to be a matter of checking the plastic it's made out of. That's always going to be the case when you're using anything that's plastic when it comes to archives, is you're always going to want to check the plastic type. And yes, exactly. The size, they come in varying sizes. So it's whatever your purpose is. Aside from that, for options where we might not choose photo corners as a viable option, we do something called hinging, which is use Japanese tissue paper and wheat starch paste. And on the back of the photograph, we adhere it, and then we adhere it to the mat board. And it's just a way of holding it onto it. Usually it's at the top side. And it just holds it to the mat board, and it is reversible, and it is stable.
Thank you, Cassidy. Also, you mentioned it a little bit in your presentation, but there is a follow-up question. Why does the paper from the 50s era books yellow, degrade, and crumble, but older books from the late 19th century and early 20th century stay in great shape?
That has a lot to do with how paper production altered over time. So there was at one point a switch to produce paper in a quicker manner. And when it came to that, a lot of additives occurred, a lot of removal processes were skipped. So it came more to a matter of they were trying to cut corners. And because of that, either materials and inherent materials within the paper itself weren't properly washed out, or additives were included. And all of these things do cause the paper to degrade faster than paper that might have been produced before that, where it was done a little bit more naturally and thoroughly processed. So a lot of it has to do with just the production method is why you're going to see paper deteriorate differently amongst time in comparison to newer paper. There was even a switch. Paper production has gone through a lot of changes over history, pretty extensive changes too. But a lot of it is going to be the production process is what's going to cause certain eras of paper to degrade quicker than others. And that's an inherent bias, unfortunately. And so a lot of that time you don't notice it until it's already happening. And a lot of the time we can do something called paper washing, which will wash out those additives or any of the chemicals within the paper that's causing its deterioration, and will you'll see like a strengthening of the paper, but when it comes to yellowing, there's not really much that can be done for that.
Thank you, Cassidy.
Start.
Okay. All right. So Stephanie is going to have a go at demonstrating how to do encapsulation. So we realized a handout that covers encapsulation, the 4-flap folder, and a portfolio. And Marina, I don't think I included this to.
No, I don't think so. Is it ASAs?
Well, it was done by Mary Huckluck for ASA,
Okay.
but I can send it.
If you don't mind sharing this, yes.
Yeah, I think that'd
great.
be okay. So I can send it to you and then you can forward it on to whoever's interested. Yeah, but anyway, this Stephanie will give you an idea of how it works and you'll be able to practice with your own pieces if you are so inclined. Right, thank you, Stephanie.
So hello, welcome back from break. My name is Stephanie Olson. I'm a conservation intern here at the archives. You can't see my face, but know that I'm smiling.
We can't see your face either, so it's okay. She's got her mask on still.
So today I'm going to talk to you and show you an example of encapsulation. So encapsulation is really good to stabilize documents, specifically documents that need to be frequently handled or those that are in pieces. Don't freak out, that was just a postcard from the gift shop. So yeah, it's really useful to be keeping pieces together and for allowing for handling. There are some instances where encapsulation is not a good idea. So any object with mold on it, should not be encapsulated, as it will continue to grow and spread, and it will just create a nice, warm, humid environment for it to fester. Blueprints should also not be encapsulated as they tend to off-gas, and objects with friable media such as watercolors, pastels, pencil and charcoal drawings, gouache and parchment, as well as photographs where it is flaking or where the media is flaking off. So to start, I will take a piece of Mylar, which is a polyester film. It is also called Melanix, but Mylar is the trade name for the DuPont company, which is a trusted and valuable source. So the first thing you do with your Mylar is you rub it with a cloth. And now encapsulation works through the physics of static electricity. So you rub your piece of Mylar with the cloth and create some static. Then it should stick pretty well to your cutting mat. Now your cutting mat, it will be helpful if you have lines and grids to keep everything square and straight. So yeah, after you charge your Mylar, you can place your photograph onto the sheet and align the pieces so that they fit together nicely. Okay. Now you need to weight the photograph down so it doesn't move, or whatever piece of document you're working on. So you can take a piece of anything, really, anything that will not scratch the surface, and put it down onto the piece before you put your weight on, like so. Okay, and then you will take some double-sided tape, and while tape is a curse word in this institution, it is okay because, as you can see in my example, no, you can't. Anyway, there is a gap all around the edge so it will not touch.
I had them right here. You might have put it under the.
So,
I thought you put the handout on top of something earlier, but I didn't realize what it was.
so as you can see, there is double-sided tape, but it's only touching the Mylar. There is a gap about a quarter of an inch all the way around. So once you have your piece weighted, you can take your double-sided tape. And yeah, there's a specific way that you should tape this. You should put the tape around your hand and grab the tail. Now, you never want to have your tape out like this before you start to move it around your object. That would be very dangerous if you were to accidentally touch your document with the tape. So leaving about a quarter inch of space, you will go all the 4 pieces of tape all the way around your document, leaving a gap at each corner. That's very important because you want airflow in and around your object to prevent buildup of off-gassing and yes, and prevent creasing in the Mylar. Awesome. Now this is key. Do not remove the top part of the double-sided tape. Leave that on for now, or else you'll cause yourself a world of pain. So now you take a second sheet of Mylar, and you also have to charge this piece. So just rub it gently with a soft cloth. A cotton glove would work, so would a microfiber towel. Beautiful. Now you can very gingerly remove the weights and the sheet on top. Perfect. And place the second sheet of Mylar on top, making sure it is clean, dust-free, and nothing is trapped that you don't want trapped. Check the alignment of your photo or pieces and place the charge sheet on top. Like so. Replace the weight. And now finally you can begin to remove the side pieces of tape. So very carefully lift one side at a time, peel away and place down. You can take the cloth and rub it down to smooth out any air bubbles.
It helps when you have fingernails too.
Yeah, it does.
So it's very annoying. But not fake nails, because that's even worse.
Now the more tape you apply, the harder it's going to be. So this third and fourth piece will be relatively difficult. Okay, and make sure you lay it down flat, one side to side, rub it down. And finally, the last piece. Perfect, like that. Fantastic news, we've done it. Now, we need to trim it. So, yeah, you should trim it fairly close to where you have the tape. Right nearly on the line. Try to keep your lines straight and clean. Always be careful when working with sharp materials. And press down firmly with your ruler. I should mention as well that encapsulation like this is scalable. So you can do it for a multitude of sizes of objects from very tiny to quite large. Although your technique will change. There are several different ways that you can go about encapsulation, whether it's folding over pieces and corners to reduce the amount of tape you need, or for different levels of structural support. There are examples and lots of different methods. So yeah, now this is trimmed down, but the corners of Mylar are quite sharp. So either you would want to take some scissors and round the corners nicely, or we have a fancy dancy machine. That's a corner rounder. So you place your document in. And 4. Okay. Hold on. Perfect. Thank you.
Beautiful. Stephanie or Alison, there's a question about cutting mat. Is there any alternative to it?
Well, the cutting mat, you could maybe use, well, okay, so the cutting mat serves a couple of purposes. One of them is to protect the table that you're working on. That's probably the main reason, but it also is safer. So if you can at all get a cutting mat, it's a good investment. And they're double-sided, so you might have the same mat for 20 years and it would be fine.
And there are also smaller sizes that are more
Yes.
affordable, which
Yeah.
which may be enough for you. And also many of them are self-healing. Is it correct?
Yes.
Or
Yep.
am I reading?
The
Yep.
ones we bought at, you can try drafting stores. They often sell them.
Michael's too.
You can get them at Michael's. You'll probably pay a lot for
Probably
it.
the dollar
But
store.
you can also look for them at quilting shops. Yeah, I have seen really small ones at the dollar store too.
Yeah.
So
Fabric stores have them too.
fabric stores, yeah. Yeah,
Okay, thank
definitely.
you.
But yeah, it is, if you're gonna invest in something, this is a good one. The other thing is, you might have noticed the weird ruler that Stephanie was using. You can use a plain, like a corkback ruler. But it's, this is actually a safer version. So what happens is you place the ruler down on the object that you're cutting, and your fingers are more protected. People don't often consider archival work as being dangerous particularly, but as somebody who still has no feeling in this part of my thumb, I can tell you that cutting materials in an archives can be dangerous to your hands. So getting a ruler like this is something worth thinking about.
Where do you get it?
Drafting stores should have them.
Okay. So you mentioned several times that encapsulation is reversible. So you
Yes.
can't.
Yep. So this is one that we did before as a sample. We have a lot of these postcards, so we use these as examples in many cases. So this is one that's been done before. So if I wanted to take it out, I could easily cut it with scissors or a knife and take it out. So the other thing I should point out is that this kind of material, you can scan through it. So we often use it to prepare sleeves for items that go through our oversized scanner. And if an item has been encapsulated already, we don't have to take it out.
Even those that goes through the scanner, actually physically through the scanner?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we have an oversized scanner that does that. And we do that to protect the item.
It also doesn't always have to be enclosed on all 4 sides.
No.
You can also leave it open on a side. It all depends on the stability of the object
Yeah.
itself. If it is in multiple pieces like this, then obviously it's going to be best to enclose it on all 4 sides. But if you're just doing it as an additional protection for handling, you can leave it open on one side, and that also makes it available to be removed later if
Yeah.
need be.
But yeah, it's very easily reversed.
Yeah.
So
I was gonna say, the focus on reversibility for this is because a lot of people, the alternative option, like we said before, is people choose lamination, and that's very much not reversible because it fuses with the surface of the paper, and they are now one,
And
and
it's
they
very,
will never
very
be two
difficult.
again,
yeah,
so,
it's very, very difficult to remove it, if ever.
yeah.
Handout that I will send you, Marina, is for 3 different activities, actually. Sorry. So
Alison,
the-
can we answer a few more questions before we
Oh,
move
sure.
on? Yeah. So just a general question, overarching question. So do you recommend encapsulation as a preservation method for photographs?
For photographs, yes, provided the emulsion is stable and there's no evidence of mold. And you know that your storage environment is going to be stable and not, yeah, it's going to be stable and not fluctuating.
Mhm.
And the photo, I mean, all of this is kind of dependent on, actually, do you want to fiddle with that? Just, I feel like I'm talking to a wall.
Yeah, that's good.
Hello.
She needs to be on display again.
Yeah, I need to be on display. Yeah, so when it comes to encapsulation, there are different grades of Mylar, like they're different thicknesses. And if you get samples of them, you can see just how stiff. So that, for example, the 5 mil is a really stiff plastic, whereas the 2 is really flexible, and it's the kind of thing that's used in book jackets that you would wrap around a book. This is probably a 3, maybe even a 4. Probably a 3.
I was gonna say 3.
Yeah. And so it's sort of, I think a 2 or 3 is better for encapsulation for most items. But it does mean that you have to, like you don't want the Mylar to be fighting against the object that's in it. So if it's an object that maybe is really warped and not flat, then encapsulation may not work as well. But sometimes it'll help preserve the pieces, keep the pieces together. So it sort of is you have to do it on a case-by-case basis.
And if I may mention, if I understood the question correctly, there are other ways, as was mentioned by Cassidy. You can store photographs in acid-free envelopes, specific envelopes, or in pockets from print file, for example.
Yep.
And that's a much faster way because encapsulation takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
So you don't want to do it to all of your
No.
photographs.
I've done 400 of these for maps in about 3 days. And it was unpleasant, let me tell you. My thumbs did not like me very much at the end. So yes, this is something that we do for objects that are unusual sizes or just the situation calls for it. You know, if it's an item like a map that's in poor condition, then we might encapsulate it.
Or a lot of handling.
Or if
We
it's,
expect
yeah,
a
if
lot
it's
of
something that's
handling.
going to be handled very frequently.
Right.
So yeah, it's one of those skills that's good to have in your back pocket to pull out when you come across
And a related question was about posters, and you were talking about maps, so the same would apply.
Yeah,
So
same
this is a
idea.
good
Yeah.
approach.
And posters are probably a good example of where this works well because they're printed. It's usually a lithograph or some other kind of stable printing, and you don't usually have issues with media lifting off. So yeah.
And as a preventive measure, that's a good approach to
Yes.
encapsulate them. Okay. Are there any other enclosures for posters that are transparent that you would recommend?
You may be able to find some pre-made ones.
Oh, they're very expensive.
They're very expensive. The other problem is because they're pre-made, you might struggle to get the object inside it. Whereas this you construct around the object. But if you have to wrestle a poster into a pre-made sleeve, that might be problematic. You can get some that are sort of L-shaped, so they're only enclosed on 2 sides. Those might work. but again, they're going to be more expensive. So you buy this, Mylar comes on a roll, and you can get it in different widths typically, but you can get it in sort of small rolls, so you don't have to buy a huge amount. You can also try to find this at drafting stores, art and drafting stores may sell this.
It's also, because it comes on a roll, it's also important to note that it does tend to have a natural curve because it's on a roll.
Yeah.
So you kind of keep that in mind when you're working with it, that it does naturally curve in a specific direction. So sometimes
hard to
it's
see here, but-
easier to keep it, to enclose with it in the same curve so that it's easier to work with.
Good point. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I think that's all the questions so far.
Okay, well, if anything else comes up, we'll keep talking. Okay, so
My apologies. One more. I missed one more.
that's okay.
Sorry.
There's always one more question. I will say that. There's never really an end to
I
question.
didn't scroll down enough. Are page protectors completely out if, for example, the pieces are small enough? Many organizations do not have huge funds. Anastasia, do you mind speaking up? I am not sure I understand the question.
I think she's talking about the standard office page protectors.
You got it. Thank you.
Yeah, we have those here at the archives, and we use them for various things, but not for our collections. You'd have to find out exactly what the plastic is. I mean, this stuff is easier to come by than it used to be. You know, there was a time when you couldn't find polypropylene anything, but I think now it's easier. So you might have to look at the brand and see if you can get some information from the manufacturer. Just saying something is acid free or archival is not really, it's not really answering the question, because there's no legal definition for the word archival. You can say anything is archival, and nobody can fight you on it. So it is a bit dodgy at times, but yeah, I think some of them are okay, but you do need to take the, if they have any paper inside, that needs to go, because you can pretty well bet that's not going to be archival or acid. Yeah, as long as it doesn't have PVC, then you're probably okay. I mean, a lot of these things are going to have coatings on them, but there's not a lot we can do about that. You kind of have to work with what you can and what you can get your hands on. Okay. Any other questions?
No, we're good for now. Let's move on.
Okay. All right. So I had scurried off for a minute before. Now I have something to add. So for the handout that I will send out to Marina, there's actually 3 different activities in there. And so it starts off with encapsulation, like she just showed you. But then there's a 4-flat folder. So this is folder stock that we buy, and this is the kind of thing that we use mostly for oversized map storage or oversized documents. So we would just use the oversized folder, usually in a like 24-36 size or bigger, and then put it in a flat storage cabinet. So we wouldn't necessarily put it in a portfolio, but this is just an example. So the idea is the 4 flaps are useful. When I first started here many years ago now, we had a lot of cabinets that just had a big piece of folder stock that was folded in half. And boy, does that make life difficult. Because every time somebody tries to get something out of there, the contents are falling out, and they're all different sizes. And so in the last 20 years, we've started doing 4 flat folders where the sides actually serve to keep the object inside, and that really limits damage just from handling not even direct handling, but sometimes handling other things in the same drawer. So think about that as a way of storing it. Now, the other reason we do the portfolio is because there are times when we might have, say, a pamphlet or something that's quite delicate. And say if this is often used in library or reference situations where you have a very small book or something very delicate, and it needs to sit upright on a shelf. So this would serve to support a really thin book or provide support for something really delicate. And you can make these small enough to fit in a file folder if you wanted to, or big enough to fit in a flat storage cabinet, or it can sit upright on a shelf. And you can actually label it. So this is just mat board, which you can buy through a framer. We get our stuff from Folk Graphis, which is a local mat board supplier. And I would say most major cities have companies like that. But this is 100% cotton rag board, which is our sort of standard that we use for archives. And typically, now you can get different colors. And I mean, I have a lot of the off-white, the antique white mat board. We have a lot of this stuff because we do use it for framing purposes. But consider getting something that's sort of a light gray or something that doesn't show the fingerprints quite as much. Because it does get kind of annoying after a while, to tell you the truth. And you don't want to have to clean your portfolios. That would be really unfortunate. So anyway, when you get the instructions, you can certainly try that. This is actually gummed linen tape, which you can also get at art supply stores.
Smells
It smells very bad, but it does work. If you're wondering about the gagging noise, that was Cassidy. I think she forgot that we're on microphone. But yes, so there's that for you to look forward to.
The beautiful thing about the 4-flap folder too is that it's so customizable to the size of the object, which will prevent it from shifting around too much. Whereas if you just have a folded folder that you might have bought pre-made, it's not necessarily going to protect the object to the best of its ability. If it's able to slide around even a lot in that. So you always want it to kind of be as close to the size as possible with a little bit of room.
Yes. Okay, so I will start by going through the questions that Marina forwarded me from those of you that so kindly sent them on to her. I think proper handling and storage was covered mostly by Cassidy. And it's funny because just yesterday someone brought in a photograph to the lab and it had been torn because someone had tried to take it out of a folder without taking the folder out of the box, and it was actually too tightly packed. So that's what Stephanie is going to be working on very soon. She's excited, let me tell you. You can't see her face, but she's excited. So yeah, it's important for not just the people who are preparing the archival records to know how to handle records, but the people who are using them. One of my coworkers always says that the worst pest that we have to think about and the most damage done by pests is actually that done by our research clients. So, I mean, I don't know that I'd call them a pest, but you know, it's certainly just the handling of records, and that's the nature of what we're doing. So we kind of have to be prepared to deal with that as we go along. So for labeling, I think the presentation did touch on that a little bit. We always advise people to focus on labeling the enclosures like the file folders, envelopes, and sleeves, because you cannot label every single thing. Certainly, there's just too much of it.
Alison, Cassidy had in her presentation slides, she had file folders that had actual labels on them. Would you recommend writing with a pencil or
well, that is certainly the case in archives. that deal with government records, because we have a lot of boxes that need to be labeled. So some of our boxes, most of our boxes do have printed labels. The file folders, I have qualms about, partly because some of these labels, they can fail depending on the environment that the records are stored in. So, and then if the label falls off the file folder, then it falls into the folder, and then it sticks to something else, then it causes another problem. So I'm not a super huge fan of labels directly on file folders. I think it's easier, and certainly if you have a small enough collection that you're working with, it's easier and probably just as fast. By the time you have to prepare the labels, it's probably not worth it. So I would go with a pencil, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, we do
now,
the same, and I always recommend too.
Yeah, I just feel like it's looking for trouble later on.
You
So-
also had some stamps. Sorry, Alison, it's just related to the same. I also noticed there were stamps on
Yes.
some of the file folders. What are those?
Yes, that again is something to make it easier. Because we have a separate, we have a government records program and a private records program. We have different stamps for that, but again, that's just on the front of the
File folder.
Yeah. And so it shouldn't come in contact with anything in any of the contents. And again, it's just to make it easier, because it's a consecutive stamp, so it actually numbers the file folders for you as you go along, which if you're working in a massive government records collection, that's actually very useful. But again, for most small collections, it's probably not worth it. Now, as far as what to use to label, if you are putting a label on, say, a map or some kind of oversized document, an original object, the soft pencil is better. 6B is nice, but a lot of people don't like using them because they're too soft. So if you went with a 4B, that's actually a little bit better. It's a little bit harder, but it's still soft enough that it's not going to leave an impression. Because I can tell you that there's nothing worse than trying to remove even a pencil label from a document and realizing that someone's used a mechanical pencil and it's so pointy that it's actually damaged the fibers of the paper, so that the number is still visible even after you've erased it. So think about that in future, and definitely I would go with a 4B pencil. And again, that's something that's easily found at an art supply store. You can usually buy them individually too. You don't have to buy the package of them.
What about photographs, especially the newer type that are glossy and very...
Yeah, that's really hard. People really don't like using the 6B pencil on that.
Because it smudges so easily.
Yeah, it smudges so easily. That's where I would probably focus on labeling the envelope or the sleeve that it's in.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you can use like a Sharpie marker, or what's actually best recommended, I think, is the Sakura gel pens for labeling plastics. But again, if you ever have to change a number, it's really hard to do. So focus on the, I would focus on the enclosure rather than the.
What's your opinion on archival ink pens? You know, those micron.
Yeah, you could use those. My problem with those is that they usually dry out. Mind you, this is Alberta, so everything dries out before you get to do anything with it. So yeah, you could probably use those as well. I think the Sakura ones are really, they've only just been tested in the last few years, so and they might be a little harder to come by. But again, if you're using an envelope, you can just use a pencil. So now for the enclosures, you can just go with the 4B pencil. If you are going to use a mechanical pencil, do your writing before you put anything inside it because it can actually transfer. So what else was I going to say? Oh, the other thing is, and this is just a handling thing, but if you make a decision about where to label objects. So for example, if I'm going to start going through a whole collection of posters, or say it's a collection of posters, make a decision about where you're going to label each one. So if it's the reverse of the lower right-hand corner, that's where you label all of them. And the idea is that the label should be as small as possible and along the edge, not in the image portion of the object, just because you want it to be easily removable and you don't want it to be obvious. I can't tell you how many times I've turned a map over and there's a very large accession number written on the back. It looks like a 4-year-old wrote it. Archives is one area where handwriting, good handwriting, still counts, believe it or not. Okay, any specific questions about labeling or? I don't think so. All right. Okay, so now we'll get on to
language on labels.
Sorry, language?
Labeling in original or translated. Oh, that's because a lot is Ukrainian. Well, it depends on your in-house policies and procedures. It could be just a unique identifier or accession number or whatever you want, or yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as far as labeling goes, we the good thing about using just like having a standard numbering system is that it then refers you to a file list, which then can give as much detail as you want. You can have it in both languages if you want. And I think some of ours are actually written that way.
We have some of our file folders have French. If the document is in French, they'll have the French title of it written out.
It'll have English and French on it. But as far as like a unique identifier, everything gets a file number. And then any more detail than that comes in at the file list level. So the other thing is that it's much easier to find things if you just have a numbering system worked out. It's easier than trying to find something based on like sort of an objective title that one person used, but somebody else might describe it a different way. So it gets a bit, this is a little less subjective. Okay, so I mentioned rare books. So yesterday, actually, Stephanie, do you want to show off your little? So this is a version of the 4-flat folder.
Sure. So this was fairly simple to make, and again, can be made in many different sizes and arrangements. Here I used some folder stock to work with this really very delicate book. Remove it carefully. There. So what we're looking at is this. So it is 2 separate pieces of folder stock that I have double-sided taped together on the inside. One that goes lengthwise and one that goes widthwise. Yeah, so this kind of thing can be used for 2-dimensional objects as well as 3-dimensional objects like rare books. And with the 3-dimensional objects, you just have to be careful to ensure that you're leaving enough space for the height of the book here. Yes, so they come together quite nicely and they're protective against dust, handling, and they provide a little bit of structure and support as well.
So this book in particular is a damaged book, and it's one that Stephanie will be rebinding before her internship. But this often comes up because people have books that are not in very good condition. So you might have the boards that are loose, you know, parts of the text block are separating. And sometimes you'll see, you know, you can get these kind of elastic bands that you can, they're actually marketed for libraries to keep things together. That's not the best option, especially when you're thinking about rare books or, you know, just bound material in whatever form. So this is a good option to keep all the bits and pieces together until you can do something with it. And because what happens is if you tied something like this around this book, this is fine because it's a hard cover, but the text block can still move and you end up with a string or tape that will actually cut the pages or the cover if it's a soft cover. So it ends up not necessarily preventing more damage, but actually causing more. So this little 4-flap folder is a good option to sort of protect everything, keep all the bits and pieces together. And you don't have to worry about the string actually causing more damage.
And they look nice,
And they look nice.
but that's just my opinion. I made it, so
Yeah,
I have to say that.
A little bit of bias
a
here.
little bit biased. But again, you can make these if it's a book that's small enough and it fits in a file folder or not. You can use the enclosure to label it, and then it seems to be much happier. At least it will be until it's rebound by Stephanie. Yeah. Okay. And it can actually even be stored up right on a shelf if you need to store it that way. Any more questions about books or bound volumes? So in talking about the reasoning for why books are such a mess, the late 19th century, by around 1850, wood pulp was being used to create more paper because there was an increase in demand with the Industrial Revolution. There was more of a demand for print materials. And so people kept looking for new material to make paper out of. Prior to that, it was mostly cotton and linen. So they were actually rags. There's a reason why we call it rag paper. Best quality paper was actually made from cotton rags. But by about 1850 or so, they realized that wood pulp could be used. And that was sort of to the library's detriment because it's so acidic that the pages, many libraries saw a lot of their collections deteriorate past the point of saving because of that. And so that just added to the preservation problem. So I've seen newspapers from 1804 that were perfectly fine that you could, you know, even at the U of A, there's a copy of the Nuremberg Chronicles from 1491. So it actually predates Columbus. And the pages are perfectly fine. There's not a thing wrong with it. It's probably cotton or linen, and it's in better condition than a book that was printed in 1900. So that's just the nature of the material we have to deal with, unfortunately. Okay, so someone asked about textiles. Now we have, textiles. Okay, let's talk about that. So it sort of depends on the type of object that you're dealing with. But the important thing, I think, is for three-dimensional objects, you need to be able to protect it from pollutants and dust and all the rest, but also take up as little space as possible. And depending on the item you're talking about, actually, let's talk about flat textiles first. So one option is to roll it. And this is something that we do with maps and plans and things as well. So see, my little elves are coming to clean up my space. Excellent.
And in our case, it would be embroidered ritual towels, let's say.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That can also be rolled.
Yes, yep, totally. So one of the materials that I think is mostly underrated, but is actually very affordable and easily sourced is unbleached cotton. So what you can do is you can go to a fabric store and buy a bolt of this stuff. You want to wash it really well in hot water and use like a mild detergent if you're going to use any, because you want to get any sizing out of it. You want it to be as soft as possible. You can even, well, it's a good idea to put it in the dryer. And you can iron it so that everything looks much more acceptable. But basically it is just this. Now this is stored upside down, but that's okay. In this case, that's it. It's now this is a, so this is another reason why Mylar and Melanex are our favorite products, because they come on these handy dandy rolls that we then repurpose to roll items for storage. So what we do, because these aren't acid free, what I did with this one was I covered it in Mylar. The Mylar that it came on it in the first place, because it's the same size. And then I just cut a piece of unbleached cotton and put around it, and that will allow me to roll the object up. Now, you kind of have to be aware of how much texture a textile has, because if it's something that's got a lot of, you know, you don't want to flatten it. If it's something that's been embroidered and it's got more dimension, you really don't want to flatten that kind of and lose that kind of aspect of it. So if you do have to roll it, it's kind of like a painting in that you would, and this is why it was rolled inside out. Because what you want to do is roll it with the decorative side facing out. So what you could do is actually put another piece of fabric on top of this, and you can actually layer small flat pieces and roll them if you are so inclined. Then I just took some unbleached cotton, or sorry, some cotton tying tape and tied it around. Now you can also, if you're really concerned about dirt, you could put this in a polyethylene bag, or you cover it with another layer of Mylar, but that might be overkill depending on what your storage area looks like. But yeah, this will help protect the fabric pieces on the inside. The other thing is that, well, I mean, the other thing to think about is how susceptible the dyes in your pieces are to relative humidity. So depending on how sensitive they are, they might need to be stored individually. I don't know. That would, you'd have to know a lot more about your collection than I would. But if it's contemporary, it's, you know, or 20th century, it's probably more water, color fast than earlier pieces. But again,
I understand many people are concerned about embroidered shirts, let's say, so
Oh,
they won't be rolled, of course.
yes, yeah, no, that's another good one. So, thank you, Vanna. So another option for storing costume or clothing is, and in thinking about finding pieces that are easily accessible, supplies are easily accessible. This kind of thing is a Rubbermaid. So most Rubbermaid containers should say what kind of plastic they are. But it's easy enough to figure out, to find out. But once these are washed really well inside, they can be used to store quite a few pieces. Now, I don't really have a good example, but you can use unbleached cotton for this. A lot of people use tissue. So this is the kind of tissue that you would use for interleaving. that Cassidy was talking about earlier. But it actually has multiple purposes. So you can scrunch it up and use it to support, say, a hat or some kind of hollow object that's still really light, but you don't want to just kind of fall over time. But you can also make little tubes of this stuff or scrunch it up and put it into sleeves of a shirt. But I would start with, if you're using a container like this, or any container really, I would use unbleached cotton more than the tissue, because it will last a lot longer. And you can actually take it out and reuse it for something else. It's and I'd say probably the cost is probably comparable. When you consider that you have to buy probably a package of 500 of these sheets. So you may find that this is more accessible, and you can just go to the fabric store and buy it as you need it, which makes it a lot more accessible and affordable in the short term.
And a package of 500 is about $100, I would say.
Yeah,
So it's really, yeah, you may want to go for cotton.
yeah, cotton is and you can use these to make little pillows too. So you can make, say, if it's a shirt or a vest or something, you can almost make like a little mannequin inside if you're concerned about it, because that'll help reduce the creasing in the shirt. And then it just, it will just help stabilize it a lot more, and you won't have to worry. If you pad out the sleeves, they won't flatten out, and so it's more, if you want to use it for exhibit, say, yeah, it'll keep its shape much better. So padding it out is definitely the most interesting, or the most useful thing you can do. I mean, this is just an example of an apron that I had in the lab, but you can see how it's been folded for a long time, and that crease is not going anywhere anytime soon. But what you could do is, if you do have to fold something, because of course you can't lay everything perfectly flat, what you can do is make like a sausage to fit under it, within the crease, and then that helps pad it out and reduces the creasing over time.
Alison, would you say that using acid-free boxes is a preferred way over the plastic box?
Well, there are benefits for both of these things. The boxes are better in the sense that there's more airflow, there's more air circulation. But at the same time, a lot of people have so many problems finding a place to store them that I think sometimes the plastic boxes are better because they're more resistant to water. You know, these things end up in so many different storage environments that it's kind of hard to say, because you do need to really figure out what works best for your collection and where you know it's going to live. But, you know, a lot of wedding dresses get stored in this kind of box, I can tell you that, because it's definitely more useful, and it can be tucked away in different places. And the other thing is, these are, well, I mean, they can all be stacked. Oh, that's the other thing I should mention. You have to consider the weight of an object. So, for example, if you have two shirts, for example, what you could do is pretend this is a bigger one. You lay one out in the cotton, everything's padded out. Rather than stack another shirt directly on top of it in the same orientation, what you could do is reverse it so that the tail of the shirt rests on the top of the other one, and the shoulders are at the other end. That way it avoids having, you know, all the weight in one area, and then everything gets crushed. So that's something else that you need to consider. maybe less of an issue for flat textiles. You could layer them on top of one another much more easily, but for three-dimensional garments, I would consider separating them unless they can be kind of reoriented. The other thing is you might have bits and pieces that go together with, you know, one object. So that can be, you say if you have one, like say it's a christening dress and then there's some smaller pieces that go with it, like shoes or, you know, something else that you don't want to have separated, like a bonnet. You can also pad those out and place them at the end or at the bottom of the container. Anything else I can think of?
Somebody had a question about the type
Oh,
tissue. It should be acid-free and lignin-free, but they want to know if it should be buffered or not buffered if touching embroidery.
I would go with unbuffered. Mainly because you don't know, and it's not always easy to tell. I mean, I don't think it's the end of the world if you use the buffered, but it's easier if you just use unbuffered, I think.
Yeah.
Because if you use buffered storage materials next to proteinaceous
If it's
threads,
silk
or
thread.
yeah, if there's silk in the thread, you don't want to interfere with that. So I would just go with the unbuffered stuff. Yeah.
If you're like really paying attention to the type of plastic it is, it shouldn't be a concern of off-gassing.
Let's have a look at that.
So the main concern more is the purpose and structure.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I had my druthers, it would always be. Sorry, I can't scroll down to that anymore.
Is it better if cotton is organic, unbleached cotton?
I think as long as it's washed well, it should be fine. And unbleached cotton is certainly easy to find because it's often used in quilting and other kinds of.
Organic is also such a broad.
Yeah,
Organic's another one of those terms where there's only so many standards that need to be met for it to be labeled organic. So even with organic, you can't always guarantee exactly what processes were used sometimes. So
yeah, I'm just looking at this. Yeah, this textile storage kit, yeah, I mean, this box is just a Hollinger box. There's nothing different about it. If you go to Car McLean and buy a textile storage box, it's the same thing. So it sort of depends on what your budget is like. I mean, I think overall, I would probably choose the Hollinger box storage. Can you clarify when to
People are
use-
asking if how often the cotton should be changed.
It doesn't need to be.
Do you need
Unless
to
it's-
wash it?
Not if it's in storage, no. I mean, you wash it before you use it.
Mhm.
But then you shouldn't need to take it out unless it gets dirty or if you notice that it's dusty. It's not. Going down
And we
to-
will share the links to vendors and names of vendors
Yeah.
either at a later time or in a follow-up email. I don't
Yeah.
want to waste time on that. Can you clarify when to use buffered products versus unbuffered? And it's not only textile related, I understand the
No.
question. Right?
Generally speaking, actually, I have a handout that I can send out for that. I have a good handout that a previous intern did.
Yeah.
So we will send that out. But generally, buffered materials are for products that are, for objects that are becoming acidic as they age. And it's causing deterioration. So for example, acetate and nitrate negatives, we generally store in buffered envelopes because as they age, they release acetic acid and nitric acid. But for something like color photographs, we don't. We use unbuffered for those because the buffers in the buffered material can actually interfere with the color processes. So yeah, it's a bit of a struggle sometimes. What else? The other thing is, like we said before, anything that's protein-based doesn't generally like being stored long-term in contact with anything that's buffered. So say if you have a parchment document, that really shouldn't be stored next to a buffered material. I think that's the main one.
Yeah, and like protein based is pretty extensive. It's like anything that's leather, but also anything, like I said, that's like produced by an animal. So like silk, anything like things that are like even wool.
Yeah.
Is protein based.
Yeah.
So a lot of textiles are going to be protein based as long as they're not like cotton. So like wool, silk, anything like that is all going to be protein based, and it should be unbuffered.
So it's generally, that's another reason why I recommend just going with unbleached cotton for storing textiles, because it makes it easier. It's more straightforward. And you don't have to worry about whether it's buffered or unbuffered. Okay, any more immediate questions about that? But yeah, Marina, if you can remind me to send you that.
I noted it down. I'll let you know.
Because my brain is like a sieve. I know.
I will remind her.
Okay, now there was a question about audiovisual records. So can that person put up their hands? Because I have a question for you.
If they're here, because we don't have everyone who registered, but we have a lot of AV. Maybe I can answer.
Okay, well, it just says that it's 35mm cellulose film. Now, what we need to know is was it produced prior to 1950? Because if it is, then it means you have nitrate film, and that could be problematic.
I don't remember who asked that.
Yeah.
If you are in the audience, can you please unmute yourself and speak up? They may not be here. Sorry, Alison,
That's okay.
don't have it at hand.
So what you need to do, if you do have motion picture film, it's important that you actually go through it and figure out what it is you actually have, because, and sometimes it's as simple as unrolling it and it'll say nitrate or acetate or safety film on the on the edge of the film. But if it's prior to 1950 and it's 35mm, then it's very likely to be nitrate. Now, the problem with that is that it needs to be in cold storage, as in frozen, if you can. And the problem with nitrate film is that it's a fire hazard. And now you can have nitrate sheet film, and it's much less of a problem. But the issue with motion picture nitrate film is the fact that it's much more likely to be degraded. And the problem then becomes its sparking point, its ignition point, as it degrades, goes down. So it doesn't take much to actually for it to spark. And especially because these films are also often stored in metal canisters where there's no air circulation. So I brought an example. Get here again. So this is a 35mm film that I think is polyester, but just so that you know what it looks like. And normally I would be wearing gloves. This is not from our collection. This is part of our teaching collection. So you can tell it's actually the wider film. And Now we have our films on these polypropylene cores. That's what they should be stored on. They should be removed from any metal cores or reels. And AV material or motion picture film should be stored in vented film cans because it often off gases so much that if it's trapped inside a metal can and can't escape, it speeds up the rate of deterioration of the material inside it. So then that causes a problem. If it's nitrate film, it can actually spark just when you open the can. I know nobody wants to hear that today of all days.
Very bad, very dangerous.
Yeah, not a good plan.
Offsite is also good.
Offsite, yes, but yeah, in the meantime. So if you do have any motion picture film, it's important to know what type it is and how it's stored and what environment it's stored in. Because these vented film cans are much better for long-term storage. So yeah, if you do have nitrate film, it's worth considering if it should be migrated to a different format and then actually destroying the original. That involves the fire department, so I would not suggest doing that yourself. Okay. Another question?
Just want to know if they can use polyester as well as instead of unbleached cotton.
I would use unbleached cotton because polyesters can also break down and you don't know what's in it.
Sometimes they're blends too.
Yeah, they could also be blends. So just go with the stuff that you can. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to set everybody off today. Things are bad enough as it is. But yeah. Yeah, avoid polyester for many reasons, but definitely for that. And yes, nitrate film needs to be identified. Anything else? Three new messages. Oh, do we need to put a desiccant in the box with the embroidery? Okay, so here's another thing. Can you pass the data logger, please? Thank you. One of the most important things you can do is actually figure out what your environment, what your storage environment is like, because you may not even need a desiccant. One of the best investments I think you can make is a data logger, because what you can do is keep track of what happens in your environment around the clock. And because some people I've heard of institutions trying to figure out why they were getting a mold outbreak, and then they find out that their systems were being shut down overnight because in an effort to save money, the overarching organization had decided to turn off, air handling, and then they were left trying to figure out what was going on with their collection. And then when they got a data logger, they were able to figure out what was happening. So I would say this is the best investment you can make. And how many you need, and it depends on the square footage of your storage area. I don't think there's, or if it's in different rooms, you might need to get two. You can get some that are not data loggers, strictly speaking, but they are temperature relative humidity gauges. So what you do is you just go in, look at it, write down what the current measures are, and then track it that way. But if you want to know what's going on around the clock, then I would suggest data logger. There's a program online called the eClimate Notebook, and it's the one that we use actually. It's free to access up to 10 data loggers, I think. And if you look at that, remind me to send the link to that. Yeah. They used to sell data loggers as part of the program, but now they don't, but they still support this. It's basically like a data analysis setup. and it's run by the Rochester Institute of Technology, and they're affiliated with George Eastman House. So they, which is a photo collection. And so they have many years of experience in analyzing environmental changes and such things. So consider getting something like that, because you may end up spending money on desiccants that you don't even need. And generally for textiles and for mixed collections, it's best to leave them at sort of an ambient temperature and relative humidity, and not try to get one extreme or the other. So it doesn't need to be, unless your relative humidity is something like 80%, then no, you shouldn't need to do anything like desiccant. It's probably fine. For an RH gauge. This is a Hobo data logger. It's from Onset Corporation. And they're very commonly used. Hanwell is another one. Now we've had Hobos, but right now we have the Pen 2, which is the one that the eClimate notebook originally sold. Sorry, the voice in my ear reminded me. Yeah, so, but yeah, the Hobo ones are really good too. And we needed a large number of them, so that's a different story. But I think they vary in price, maybe a couple $100. You could probably get them for a couple $100 now. Again,
we use Dixon 1, but only because I really like the accessibility and I can log in anytime. But we got them as a grant, so we didn't have to pay for them. They're quite pricey too.
Yeah. So yeah, you have to figure out what works best for you, and you know, where your materials are stored, and if they're all in one place, or but definitely consider doing data loggers. That will also be very useful if you need to apply for grants anywhere. Okay, any other questions? Did we miss anything?
I think we're good to move on.
Good. Okay.
I see some people are already leaving because
Oh, it's probably depending on where they are. Okay,
but
so
we are almost done with the questions.
Yes, yeah, we're almost done. So moldy records. Can you pass over my little vacuum? Yeah. So people ask what to do if you find moldy records, and so identifying mold. So mold is everywhere. You're not going to be able to remove it completely, but what you can do is reduce the risk of it coming back, and also reducing the health and safety risk of handling materials that might have dry mold. So if you have, if you notice mold growing on records that are damp, make sure they're dry. That's the first thing. It doesn't have to look pretty. They don't have to be flat. They just need to be dry. Then you can deal with it after effect. So what we do, so active mold will smear if you run your finger across it. Whereas dry mold will just brush off. And so that's what you use to your advantage. So what we do is we use a variable control vacuum cleaner, which is a Nilfisk, but there are different ones out there. And what I do, this is my example, it's the nozzle of the vacuum. And what we do is take a piece of window screening and wrap it around the nozzle and duct tape it on, because you want to be able to brush mold towards your vacuum like this, without having the vacuum suck your document up into it. That would be problematic. So hence the window screening. Now you should be doing this in an area that you can clean really well with bleach or Lysol, whatever, afterwards, or do it outside. You might want to use a mask, not that that's hard to find these days, and make sure everything's cleaned afterwards. If a document is really badly damaged to mold because of mold, you might want to consider using a plastic sleeve like an encapsulation. And then you can make copies of it or scans of it. And you might even need to consider destroying the originals. Another thing is you might want to put labels on the boxes that you have cleaned for mold, just because then it's easier for people to recognize. And some people are very sensitive to mold, so they may not be able to handle it, handle the material if they have been exposed to mold. There's also a technical bulletin from CCI on cleaning moldy objects. So that might be a good, CCI is the Canadian Conservation Institute. Remind me to send a link to that. It might also be useful. Another question was about humidification and flattening of records. So we often have to humidify records that have been rolled or folded. So, and there was a good diagram of some different examples in Cassie's presentation. The one with the, I have to say that the one with the garbage cans, one inside the other, I'm not a fan of that one. Even though it's sometimes the best way for oversized objects, I'm still not crazy about it because the documents end up becoming really damp and they're standing on end, so it can actually cause damage to it. But anyway, what we prefer to do is something called passive humidification, which is basically exposing objects to a damp environment, a humid environment, and letting the paper fibers absorb moisture or moisture vapor, I should say, and then taking it out and flattening it. So the way we do that, and this is just an example, this is a photo tray, but you could use anything from like a Pyrex dish, or actually these Rubbermaid containers are actually really good humidification chambers because they're so big. And you can use the really long ones for, say, maps or posters or things like that. But the best thing to do is the other thing that I should point out. A lot of the instructions will tell you to put water in the bottom of the tray or the bottom of the container. The safer way to do it is to use a towel, or this is a material called Tech Wipe that we have in the lab, but you can use anything basically that will absorb moisture. So cotton flannel is a really good one too. What you do is cut a piece so that it fits the bottom of your tray. Make your material fully damp, moist, and then you place it in the bottom. Then what you do is you take a screen. This is just a piece of, it's the egg crate that you can get for light fixtures. And you can just cut it with a pair of pliers. And so we cut these to size depending on the containers we're using. But basically what you're doing is you're putting a rack over top, because you don't want your object to touch the moist surface. Basically what you're doing is just putting it in a chamber and allowing it to absorb moisture. So for this one, what we would do is put the object on top and then cover the whole thing with a piece of plexi and then weight it down so that there's no, there's very little air leakage. But you can also use a plastic sheet. Or, yeah, it's better if you can actually see through it. But you can also use these containers that have a lid that you can just put on top. So that's another good option. So usually for most objects, it depends on the support, so the type of paper. If it's a really heavy paper, you might need to leave it in there a little longer, but what we would do is sort of unroll it so that it's more like a scroll, and then the air, the moist air can move around a little more easily. But usually about an hour is enough. What you want to do is have the inner environment come up to about 80% relative humidity. So, and usually after about an hour, that's time enough, but that you can, you have to go by feel. So you do need to actually test out a few different examples. But there are some caveats, like Cassie mentioned, the condition of the object. Maybe you don't want to do this if it was previously mold contaminated, because you do need to be careful of that, and you may need to clean it again. The other thing is the media, it can actually be really sensitive to moisture changes. So if it's, say, a letter that's written in ink, it will probably bleed. So you need to be very, very careful. I would use this probably for something like newspapers or posters or maps or things that are printed rather than handwritten, because there's just so much variability in the in handwritten ink that it might cause more problems than it's worth. So yeah, for something that's folded or rolled, it is possible to humidify it. You can just weight it down as it is, but it's not likely to be as successful, and you may actually see cracking, especially if it's photographs. Oversized photographs can be done this way, but it can be sort of tricky because they do tend to be on a really heavy paper. So, and usually there's a two-stage process where we have to use the chamber, but then we use another process using vortex, and then we flatten it.
And even with the chamber, if it's rolled, never start to unroll the photograph to put it in the chamber. You shouldn't really unroll photographs unless it is dampened. It shouldn't be done when it's dry, because you could potentially cause more damage. So if it's a rolled photograph, don't try to unroll a little bit method, because you might end up causing more damage.
And it might actually end up splitting the photograph. Which
Yeah.
causes more problems. Now, what to do when it's done, when it's softer and humidified? What you have to do is take it out and then weight it down between blotter paper, which is again something that you can buy at an art supply store. Now we use a product called Polytex in between. So let's pretend this is my object that I've just humidified. I would put it between two pieces of Polytex and then sandwich that between two pieces of blotter paper, and then put a board on top of that and then a weight on top of it. And that's generally how that works.
The Polytex is a good barrier because it's not likely going to stick to anything that could potentially be softened during humidification.
Now, Polytex, you might be able to find this in fabric stores as interfacing, but interfacing is usually a bit thicker, heavier than this. But what you're looking for is a non-woven smooth surface. If you use something like wax paper or something like that, that's not really going to help because it's not absorbent and it'll just stop your document from drying out. So it needs to be something that moisture can travel through, like the something like this that's non-woven.
McLean has them, I think.
Sorry?
Carl McLean, I think, has it.
Yes, yeah, it's kind of expensive though. So, I mean, if you can hit up maybe a certain, you know, if you can call a conservator at an archives and say, can you spare me a piece of this?
It's a really good material to have. We use it like a surprising amount.
We use it a lot.
labs.
Yeah.
Can you reuse it? Can you reuse
Oh,
this image?
absolutely. Yes, yeah, definitely. Yeah. And that's the beautiful part, the nice part about using the cotton flannel or a towel in the bottom of the container in the first place, because you can just take it out, hang it up, let it dry, and use it again. So yes, what's necessary and what's desirable but can live without. So I mentioned a few things that I thought were most useful: the cutting mat, a safety ruler, elephant knives. Most people have these around. I prefer, now some people use the teeny tiny ones. I like big ones just because they're safer, I think, to use than the smaller ones. A couple other little gadgets that you might find useful is a bone folder, which you can get from Carl McLean. And this is useful for scoring folder stock if you're making 4-flat folders. These are really handy. And then there's the micro spatula. And this comes in handy for a few different things, but the main purpose I use it for is removing staples. Because what you can do is just lift up the little arms of the staple and then take it out like that. But it's also helpful if you're working on something really delicate and you need to turn pages. This comes in handy.
We do love the microspatula.
We do love the micro spatula.
And brushes too. At Scalable.
Yeah, actually, another thing you can get from an art supply store is these hacky brushes. These are really soft. You can also get goat's hair brushes, and we use those for photographs because you want really soft brushes when if you're just doing general dusting, not necessarily mold removal, but actually one thing you can do is get a soft brush, but keep it only for use with moldy records, and put it in a bag and label it and keep it with your vacuum cleaner, and and that way you won't mix them up. Double-sided tape. This is the 1/4-inch double-sided tape. That's usually the size that we use. I do have some of the bigger sizes, but we don't really use those as much. This is more practical, I think, for what we use,
Yeah.
for what we need.
And even with the bristles, like you said, like goat's hair and whatnot, it's always best to stick with natural hairs is more specifically, because sometimes you can even find synthetic ones that feel soft to the touch, but they're still not going to be as soft as natural hair brushes. Therefore, there's still the potential of causing abrasion to the surface.
So the Japanese brushes are definitely the
Yeah.
better option.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's most of the questions. As far as what I think you should focus on, I would say scrutinizing your environment and figuring out what's actually happening. But in terms of supplies, I would focus on having the best quality materials that are in direct contact with the object. So sleeves and envelopes and file folders. Maybe the boxes could wait, but I wouldn't wait too long. Any other burning questions?
I think you covered it all.
Maybe more than once, that's the problem. Well, I hope this has been useful.
Oh, it's been very useful. Thank you so much. I know someone had to leave early, and some people may have other questions right after the workshop. Please feel free to email me, and I will pass them on to Alison and Cassidy and Stephanie, and they will reply. And I will send the combined replies to everyone, because I'm sure your question might be useful for many other people. So yeah, well, thank you. Any last minute questions? If you would like to say anything, you're free to unmute yourself and speak up. But I would like to thank you all. I always tell everyone that Alison is amazing, and I see she's growing an amazing team as well. And whenever I have a disastrous question, because she works in a field that all questions are disasters, I know that I can always phone her and she will help me any way she can. So thank you, Alison, for everything you do. Your expertise and your knowledge is very much appreciated. Thank you.
Glad we can help.
I feel like most conservatives experience the influx of questions from family and friends the moment they learn your career choice.
Well, I try not to overuse it, not use it too often. Yeah, so we will combine all the notes and questions that came through the workshop into something more manageable, and we will also share some vendor names that we think are reliable, and also links to them. Please note, we are not endorsing any of them. We're just recommending either what we use or we know that are also good places to shop, but you can find whatever you can find, of course, other vendors. I know that in the States it all costs like 3 times less, but custom fees are unpredictable. So
Yes.
you may, if you travel to the States, you may bring yourself and save a lot of money. But other than that, yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I hope you stay safe.
Yeah, you
And
too.
we will be in touch.
Okay,
Okay.
everybody take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.